In the 1980s, Sayamada, Japan was a peaceful place to live. The economy was booming, anime and manga were becoming an integral part of the culture. Fast forward to August 1988, Japan would see its most gruesome serial killers, Tsutomu Miyazaki. Tsutomu murdered and defiled the bodies of 4 little girls. He even practiced acts of vampirism. To learn all about Tsutomu and why he went on this killing spree, we have to go back to the beginning. So grab a hot drink and a snack and let's investigate. Before we jump into our story, don't forget to stab that subscription button as well as slash that notification bell so you'll be alerted every single time I post a new true crime story. Tsutomu Miyazaki was born on August 31st, 1962, and he suffered from a rare birth defect. This caused his hand joints to be fused together, and it prevented him from being able to bend his wrists upward. His father, Katsumi, had an incestual sexual encounter with his daughter, although he was raised to believe that the woman who raised him and reared him, Ryoko, was his mother. Tsutomu's family would spoil their children rather than spending time with them. He later said, "If I tried to talk to my parents about my problems, they just brushed me off." The Miyazaki family ran a popular newspaper, and so there wasn't a lot of time for Tsutomu to be around his family and spend time with his sisters, so he spent much of his time with his grandfather Shokichi, and he was very close with his grandfather. When Tsutomu was in school, he was ostracized by the other students. They ridiculed him for his hands and his short stature. He also really struggled making friends, and he just mainly kept to himself. But because of this, he studied very hard, and he ended up getting really good grades when he was younger. And he also became very obsessed with comic books. He even started drawing his own comics after he read tons of comics. His family said that he read all the time, and then he started drawing them himself as well. Once Tsutomu started high school, his grades began to slip, and he was not able to attend this prestigious college that he wanted to. His family was upset with him, and he ended up going to junior college instead, and he blamed not being invited to this prestigious college on his disorder. While he was attending college, his sexual desires started to become very intense. He was no longer able to satisfy himself with adult magazines and films. He started harassing other students by trying to take pictures of their underwear while they were playing sports, and he also found something much darker. He started to indulge himself in child films. Once Tsutomu was done with college, he moved back home with his family, and during this time his father was really pressuring him to come and work with him at his newspaper business, but he didn't really want to, and he also didn't want to take over the family business someday, which was his father's plan. But he ended up agreeing working with his father, and this is where he obtained access to the cameras that he later used in his crimes. In 1988, his grandfather passed away, and this deepened his depression, and he continued to isolate himself from his family. He later said that his family ignored him and he wanted someone to talk to. And shortly after his grandfather passed, he was cremated, and Tsutomu ate a portion of his ashes, saying, quote, "to retain something from him," end quote. Tsutomu continued to have issues with his family. At one point, he was watching his sister take a shower, and when she caught him, she asked him to leave, and he smashed her head up against the shower wall. And at a later date, his mother told him that he should be spending time at work, learning the trade, learning how to print newspapers properly, and instead he attacked his mother and beat her up really bad, and he just became much more violent. His family was very worried about him. On August 21st, 1988, Tsutomu celebrated his 26th birthday. The next day, he committed his first murder. On August 22nd, Marie Kano, who was 4 years old, was spending the afternoon with a friend. At 6:23 p.m., her father, Shigeo Kona, called police because his daughter never returned home. His phone call would be placed while his daughter was slowly being strangled to death. Tsutomu lured Marie back to his black Nissan Langley by asking her, quote, "Wouldn't you like to go somewhere where it's cool?" end quote, and drove Marie about an hour and a half to the woods near Shinomada Power Station. The two sat outside together in the forest for about 30 minutes before strangling her. Tsutomu engaged in necrophilia with the corpse. He then dumped her body in the woods near his home. He collected her clothes and walked back to his car like nothing had happened. Tsutomu went back to Marie's decomposed body later and removed her hands and feet, which he took back to his home and stored in a closet. He then burned the rest of her body and ground the ashes. The ashes were sent to her family along with several of her teeth, photos, and her clothing. Tsutomu wrote a postcard that read, quote, "Mary, cremated, bones, investigate, prove." End quote. After Mary's disappearance, the police started trolling all of the surrounding neighborhoods. They were handing out leaflets and searching all of the wooded areas and everywhere where Marie could possibly be. The case was tagged at this point as a missing persons case, but the police believed that it was a murder case from the very beginning. On October 3rd, 1988, Tsutomu struck again. 7-year-old Masami Yoshizawa was walking home and she was coaxed into his car. He drove her to the same wooded area where Marie's body laid and strangled Masami. He then took her clothing and sexually abused the corpse. Tsutomu later told police that Masami's body had twitched after she passed away, and this frightened him, so he ran away from the body and got in his car and drove away. When Masami was reported as a missing person, the police believed that her case as well as Marie's case were linked in some way. Although Tsutomu claimed killing Masami upset him, he committed another murder on December 12th. A 4-year-old named Ayoko Nomono was walking home from a friend's house when he again lured the young girl to his vehicle. He drove Ayoko to a parking lot at the Youth Nature House in Naguri. He undressed the girl and took several suggestive photographs of her. She then started crying and she was strangled to death by Tsutomu, and she was dead by 7 p.m. Tsutomu then attempted to drive Erika's body to where he dumped the other 2 victims in the woods. As he was driving though, he wasn't paying much attention to the road and his car got stuck in a ditch. Fearing that he would get caught, he quickly grabbed Erika's body and ran into the woods and dumped her body. As he walked back to his car, 2 onlookers were making sure that whoever got in this accident was okay. And Tsutomu just made up some excuse. He just told them, "Oh, I was just taking a walk trying to find someone in the middle of the woods." And they helped him push his car out of that ditch and he drove off quickly. The 2 men later came forward to help identify Tsutomu's car, but they mislabeled it as a Toyota Corolla, and this set the police back in their investigation. The Sayamada police connected Erika's murder with the 2 previous young girls immediately. They even set up a private office in order for investigators to focus on that case. The day after her murder, a youth center employee found Erika's clothes in the parking lot where she had been killed. The police were called and they immediately started combing the area and passing out missing persons flyers. The police began to piece together evidence and began to treat it as a serial murder case. All of the families had been bothered by strange phone calls where the person would say nothing when they picked up. If they did not answer the phone, it would stay ringing for up to 20 minutes. The families also received postcards with messages on them such as, quote, "Erika, cold, cough, throat, rest, death," end quote. Tsutomu was actively following the news as his case was happening. He became very upset one day when the police made a report with Marie's family, and they were stating that the ashes and the teeth that he sent back to her family were not Marie's. This gave them hope that Marie was still alive. He sat down and wrote a letter to her family that day. And the note stated, quote, "I put the cardboard box with Marie's remains in it in front of her home. I did everything, from the start of the Marie incident to the finish. I saw the police press conference where they said the remains were not Marie's. On camera, her mother said that the report gave her new hope that Marie might still be alive. I knew then that I had to write this confession so Marie's mother would not continue to hope in vain. I say it again, the remains are Marie's," end quote. This confession enraged the public, and the next day the Sayamada police changed Marie's case from a missing person to a homicide. The police were able to identify pictures Tsutomu sent as taken with a Mamiya 6x7 camera. They also noticed that the typeface that he wrote his letters in, as well as the paper he used, would be something that was found at a professional printing office. But police declined later on whether or not they investigated any of the local printing shops. On March 11, 1989, Marie's family was finally able to lay her to rest after forensic specialists determined the ashes and teeth did belong to Marie. Her father, Shinjio, made a public statement saying, quote, "Her hands and feet didn't seem to be with the remains. When she gets to heaven, she won't be able to walk or eat. Please return the rest of her remains," end quote. The Kunos ended up receiving a final letter from Tsutomu. He wrote, quote, "Before I knew it, the child's corpse had gone rigid. I wanted to cross her hands over her breast, but they wouldn't budge. Pretty soon, the body gets red spots all over it. Big red spots. Like the Hinoru flag, or like you'd cover the whole body with red hanku seals. After a while, the body is covered with stretch marks. It was so rigid before, but now it feels like it's full of water and it smells. How it smells, like nothing you'd ever smell in this whole wide world. Signed, Yuko Amada." By the summer of 1989, Tsutomu was becoming restless. He hadn't committed a murder in months, and he was no longer able to be satisfied by his child films nor pictures of his victims. And on June 1st, he was driving around looking for another victim, and he came across a group of young girls at a park. He saw one of the girls, and he started talking to her, and he coaxed her to take off her underwear, and when he started taking pictures of her, some onlookers saw, some neighbors, and they started chasing him off, and he ran off, and no reports were made about this incident. On June 6th, he went to a park near Tokyo Bay and saw 5-year-old Ayoko Nomono playing alone. He took out his camera and asked Ayoko to pose for him, and once she was comfortable with him, he said, quote, "Let's take some shots inside of the car," end quote. Once she got into his back seat, Tsutomu handed her a piece of gum, and she made a comment about his hands. And Tsutomu became enraged. He became very angry, and he then strangled the young girl. He claims that she died within about 5 minutes. He then tied up her hands and feet and covered her in a sheet. Tsutomu did things a little bit differently this time. He put the young girl in his trunk and traveled back to his home, where he left the body for several hours in his car. When he brought her inside, he posed her body in sexually suggestive manners and took several photos of her while he pleasured himself. And he then left the body for about 2 days before it became very decomposed and it started to smell really strong. He then knew he had to get rid of her body. He then dismembered her body and put her torso in the bathroom of a cemetery. He later burned several parts of the body, and what he couldn't, he tossed into the woods. But in his most horrific act of all, he ate her hands. Although he thought that the police were nowhere near catching him, he knew that keeping remains so close to his home would be suspicious, just in case a neighbor or somebody would come across them. So he then, about 2 weeks later, went out, brought the remains back in his home, and kept them in his bedroom in a plastic bag. On June 11th, Ayoko's body was found in the cemetery. She was then linked with the murders of the 3 previous victims. Tsutomu's murder streak quickly came to an end on July 23rd. He found 2 sisters playing outside, and he coaxed the younger sister towards a river. The other girl ran home to alert her father about what had been going on, and he ran to the river to where the younger daughter was, and he was able to knock Tsutomu down. But Tsutomu had already taken pictures of the young girl between her legs, and the father was attempting to beat Tsutomu up, but he was able to get away. Luckily, though, the father called the police, and the police were waiting at his car by the time Tsutomu made it through the woods to get back, and he was then arrested for attempting to sexually assault a minor. It took 17 days for Tsutomu to confess to murdering Ayoko Nomono. He then confessed to Erika Namba and then Marie Kano. By the middle of September, Masambi Yoshinawa's remains were found in the woods, as well as the other remains. Tsutomu then confessed to her murder as well. Police found about 6,000 tapes of adult films, as well as several pictures of his victims, and they were able to use a big portion of this as evidence. Tsutomu's father, Katsumi, refused to hire a lawyer for him. He felt that it was unfair for the victims. So the court searched for a public defender and found Junji Suzuki and Keiji Iwakura to take the case. Junji was against the death penalty, so his argument was that Tsutomu did not know right from wrong, and he was not able to take responsibility for killing these victims. The courts had 6 psychological experts examine Tsutomu, and they all determined that he was able to take responsibility for this. He knew exactly what he was doing. But Junji refused this and asked the judge for a second round of experts. And this did happen, but ultimately it didn't work out in his favor. They all also determined that Junji was able to take responsibility for this, but Junji strongly felt that Tsutomu should serve the rest of his life in a facility, or at least until he was really rehabilitated. And oftentimes this happens anywhere between 10 to 15 years, and then that person is back in the community. So the prosecutors had to work quickly, and they had about 750 pieces of evidence to use against Tsutomu. And with the evidence and with all of the experts saying that he was able to take responsibility for this, he was then charged with the murder of all 4 girls. All of the psychological experts determined that they felt that Tsutomu had either multiple personalities or schizophrenia. Tsutomu's father, Katsumi, committed suicide shortly after, and Tsutomu was given the death penalty, which he tried to appeal several times, but none of these appeals ever worked in his favor. Tsutomu was hanged on June 17, 2008. So what do you all think about this case? Let me know in the comments down below. I found it really sad and honestly really quite disgusting, and I feel like it's more so that way for me because we all view Japan as such like a peaceful place to be, and it just seems very odd when something like this happens there. But they certainly do have some skeletons in their closet, and I have very much been enjoying reading about some other Japanese serial killers that I knew nothing about. So let me know if you guys want me to talk about any more of the Japanese serial killers. There are a few of them, and they're all very interesting and bizarre. So thank you all so much for watching this video. If it shocked you, please give me a like down below, and please stay safe out there, and I hope you all have a great day. Bye-bye.